This podcast comes to you from the University of Toronto, Mississauga. We wish to acknowledge this land on which the university operates. For thousands of years, it has been the traditional land of the Huron-Wendat, the Seneca, and most recently, the Mississaugas of the Credit River. Today, this meeting place is still the home to many Indigenous people from across Turtle Island. We are grateful to work on this land, and we strive toward peace and reconciliation among all peoples. Hi, I'm Jill Caskey, Associate Professor of Art History at the University of Toronto, Mississauga. Welcome to Medieval Art Matters, a podcast where we showcase the vitality of contemporary research on the Middle Ages. In each episode, we invite a scholar to talk about a critical issue that shaped the experiences of people living centuries ago and that still matters today. I'm joined by my co-host, Professor Erika Loic, for a discussion of today's theme, sex and sexuality in the Middle Ages.
Hi, I'm Erika Loic, Assistant Professor of Global Medieval Art at Florida State University. Today we'll be speaking with Professor Karma Lochrie, Provost Professor of English and faculty member at the Medieval Studies Institute at Indiana University. Professor Lochrie's work ranges across studies of gender and sexuality in medieval culture, including the various ways female sexuality was understood. She argues in some of her work that heterosexuality as a category and as a way of thinking about sex didn't exist for the Middle Ages. Among Professor Lochrie's many publications are the books Heterosyncrasies, Female Sexuality When Normal Wasn't, and Nowhere in the Middle Ages, which explores the relevance of modern categories to our understanding of the medieval past.
Welcome, Professor Lochrie, and thank you so much for being on our show.
Thank you. I'm delighted to be here.
So we're looking at an image from a late medieval manuscript, and for those listening, it can be found on the podcast page of artofthemiddleages.com. Could you give us a basic sense of the image and the book where it appears?
Sure. The image comes from, as you said, a late medieval manuscript. It's from a very popular literary work called The Romance of the Rose. And the image is of a nun standing by a tree with a basket in her hand, and she's got penises in her basket, and she's picking other penises as if she were harvesting fruit from the tree. Of the many things that you could say about this, one is that it does not have anything to do with the content of the work. I mean, in other words, that figure does not appear in the content of The Romance of the Rose. The other thing that's interesting is that a woman painted this. We think that the woman was an illustrator of this, and they were fairly rare during the Middle Ages. Jeanne de Montbaston, I think is her name. She and her husband ran a bookmaking operation. Anyway, she was the illustrator. It has something to do with the choice she made. So it's very intriguing, both in what it means, and I don't think anybody has figured it out, and why she placed this in the manuscript.
What does an image like this tell us about how medieval people thought about sex or sexuality?
I love this image partly because of its playfulness. It could be an image that is also somewhat critical of something. It's also one of the things that as a medievalist, that I've always liked about the period is their willingness, and in a culture that was steeped in religious ideology, their willingness to make sexual jokes in the context of religion without it being, heretical. We tend to think of those things as, that a religious person would not necessarily make a sexual joke in the context of a religious subject. And I'm not saying that's what's going on here, but you have a nun and the penises. I will say that this whole penis tree thing was very popular in the Middle Ages. You can find other images of it. There's a public square in Italy where this appears. It's not with nuns, I don't believe in that one. I went to this square, and so it's in the middle of the town, and it's a huge mural. And again, what it means is not necessarily clear. I was going to tell one other little story about this image. When I first discovered it in the 90s, when Michael Camille who was a really wonderful art historian. I was living in Chicago at the time, and he was in Chicago. And I happened to be at a conference, and I was meeting him with some friends. And he came running into the bar with his book, Images on the Edge, where I first saw this. He was so excited about this image. He immediately, the book fell open, and he said, "Look at this." He was just thrilled. And I understand his being thrilled. So I just want to say that, sometimes people think the Middle Ages is really kind of boring and rigid, but that's not necessarily how those of us who study it find it.
I actually showed this in class very recently and had the exact same reaction from my own students.
Yes.
I think it delights people precisely because they think, oh, the Middle Ages must have been conservative,
Right.
Repressed. People were only having sex to procreate. It was only men and women. I mean, do you think that the fact that it's a nun is specifically to add to that element of humor? Is it taking it even beyond ideas of women's sexuality to what a nun's sexuality is supposed to be?
Very possibly, yes. And the other thing that is a possibility is that that this image is somehow critical of the text itself. The Romance of the Rose is generally regarded as a misogynistic text. The 15th century French writer Christine de Pizan famously took issue with it because of the way it talked about women and also about genitalia specifically. But anyway, the possibility that a female illustrator is illustrating with some of that in mind. In what way would this be a critique? You're suggesting maybe a critique of religion, and I think that is one possibility. But there are other kinds of critique it might be as well. One of the things that I've read is that in French, the word for penis and pen are the same. It's a tool. Even in English at that time, the word tool it still can be used that way. Anyway, this is a woman appropriating, and it is a nun here, but appropriating that creative ability that is usually associated with men. And in a way that is, humorously mocking men as well. So yes, I think it's a kind of humor that can go many different directions. Some people talk about, it must be about fertility, and I'm always absolutely not. I don't think so at all. I mean, there were fertility symbols and things like that, but these are clearly have some kind of target, and they're playful, and they have some other function than fertility objects.
I love the idea of this kind of coming out of, as you were suggesting, a critique of the Romance of the Rose itself, where the lover plucks the rose in this kind of metaphor of, in a way, sexual aggression, and this could be the nun, in fact, then embodying that same sexual agency. To some extent, I love this image because it tells us an important thing about medieval imagery as a whole, which there's rarely one interpretation that something can be about. There often multiple interpretations can be embedded in the same thing, even contradictory ones. So this is in part what makes medieval art so much fun to study, in medieval literature, of course, too. I wonder if your work in literature and in working with sexuality in texts, how can this help us broaden our own views of sex and sexuality today?
That's a great question. In my own work, I'm always thinking about sort of the way in which studying medieval topics, and in this case, the sexuality, can reflect on the present. And one of the things that I think is most important is some of the differences, some of the historical differences you find in when you look at medieval sexuality from modern. For example, the assumption in modern, in the way we think about sexuality, is that there are these categories. There's heterosexuality, there's homosexuality, but there are other kinds, there's bi and all these others, but I mean, those would be the two basic ones that we're starting with. And in my own work, I've discovered, I think, that is not at all the way medieval people thought about sexuality. For one thing, sexuality is as a part of who we are, sort of like we all identify in terms of our sexuality. Now, like you have to sometimes be upfront about what your sexuality is. I think that is foreign to medieval people. And one of the things that I delight in sometimes in talking to students about is how in the Middle Ages, they might have thought of desire as something itself that could go in many different directions, so that there was no such thing as your whole identity is bound up in having a particular sexuality. And I tell them stories, for example, and this is the religious part, that a lot of people had to go to confession. And in handbooks for priests about how to get parishioners to confess, they had to find ways to, in effect, trick people into admitting to certain, especially in the sexuality section, sexual sins. Of course, these would be sins. So when they talk about sodomy, which was understood primarily but not exclusively as anal sex, they stress that you have to be very careful when you talk to somebody about this, because if they have never heard of this and never tried it, you will introduce the desire, because people want to do these things. Whereas we think in terms of, certain desires are, these people desire this kind of sex, these people desire that kind. And although we know that it's not that simple, I think sometimes my students are just amazed that they would even think that. Like if you tell them what sodomy is, they'll say, I think I'd like to try that. So they didn't have as rigid categories as we do, nor did they understand, I don't think, sexuality as part of who they were. Certainly, desire and sexual activity were seen as something human. But, the way we think of it as an identity, I don't think they had anything like that. So I think it helps us then to shake up our own ideas. Oh, well, there are these two categories. Heterosexuality is, of course, the ideal, and the others are less ideal. And that's the way it's always been. And it hasn't been. Now, procreation, yes. And the church, of course, encouraged procreation. But so much of heterosexuality was people writing within the church wrote about so negatively that too surprises people, I think. And it's partly because chastity was the ideal, not heterosexuality. And so, because the church was, to be a member of the church, you were supposed to be chaste, or to be a monk, to be a cleric, those kinds of things.
So I love that at the very start of our discussion, you introduced Michael Camille. And in so many ways, he completely changed the field, started asking new questions about new kinds of images. From your perspective now, where would you like to see the field going? If we were to have another Camille-like moment where we open up new avenues for types of things to explore, types of questions.
Yeah, and maybe you two who work more in art history know of where that kind of work went. But I feel as if there's been kind of let's say a pause in some of that work. That is, he found a lot of images, and I'm sure there are more images to be found, but I still feel like that understanding what these images mean, we still don't know. I would like to see more of that. I know that in literary studies, people are talking about obscenity now, medieval obscenity, and that's another area where I wonder, did that even exist, or is that a product of Protestantism and some other things? But in any case, it's worth thinking about. And if we do want to think about the Middle Ages in terms of that category, maybe it might look a little bit different than it does now. Because so much of what we associate with religious morality and sexuality, I just don't think applies to the Middle Ages. And I don't want to present the Middle Ages as enlightened or really much better than we are. I know that that's not true. Certainly the condemnation of sexual experimentation and, that was real. But at the same time, there is a difference in a culture that was able to entertain funny sexual jokes in the context of its religion, and a culture that would have trouble doing that. I don't want to introduce too much, but you may know about the sexual badges, the pilgrims' badges. And those were incorporated into the idea of these holy journeys called pilgrimages. And I've tried, ask students who come from a range of different kind of belief backgrounds, what if in your own community or your church community, somebody started making these kinds of badges or brought images like this that in a religious context, and they all find that very uncomfortable, as I understand, and so I'm just trying to bring home to them how different maybe the sensibility is.
Thank you, Professor Lochrie, for coming to speak with us today. It's been a real pleasure.
Thank you for having me. I've enjoyed this.
That was Professor Karma Lochrie of Indiana University on the complexities of medieval ideas about sex and sexuality.
You've been listening to an episode of Medieval Art Matters, hosted by Erika Loic and me, Jill Caskey. Medieval Art Matters complements the book written by Jill Caskey, Adam Cohen, and Linda Safran, called Art and Architecture of the Middle Ages, Exploring a Connected World. It is published by Cornell University Press. For more information, go to the website that accompanies the book, artofthemiddleages.com, where you'll also find more podcasts in this series.
Medieval Art Matters is made possible by the support of the Department of Art History at the University of Toronto, St. George Campus, and the Office of the Vice Principal and Dean, University of Toronto, Mississauga. Many thanks to the Toronto Consort for providing the music.
This podcast was brought to you by Cited Media Productions. Thanks for listening.
You have been listening to a Cited Media production. CIDED. Find out more at citedmedia.ca.